Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, the only show that dares to be both on-premise and on-premises. Each time we meet, we bring together some IT luminaries to discuss a single concept or premise. In this episode, we're going to be discussing cloud architectures and cloud components. The question is, do you care where your SaaS application resides? I do. But before we begin, let's meet our contestants.
I'm Martez Reed. You can find me at Green Reed Tech.
I'm Justin Warren. You can find me on Twitter as @JPWarren.
I'm Ned Belvance. You can find me on Twitter at Ned1313.
And I'm Chris Porter, and you can find me at Upright Vinyl.
So today's premise is all about IT infrastructure. And the question is, do you care where your SaaS application resides? Do you care what application it is, what hardware it's running on, what service provider it's running on? And frankly, I think you should, because there's a time when that knowledge might help you or might help you make a better decision. Isn't that right, Martez?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, when you start looking at the availability of the service that you're leveraging, I mean, there's some inherent importance there. Even if you're provided with an SLA, if there's an outage in your service provider, even though you're sort of guaranteed credits back or something like that, there's still an outage to your primary business.
And having that knowledge, knowing where it's running and knowing what's underneath it might help you make that decision, either decide not to use that application or decide to use it in a different way, right?
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely influences sort of the decision you make to, if you're trusting of that provider in terms of their ability to deliver a highly available solution, it really matters.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Australia, which is a long way away from everywhere else. So if my SaaS application lives in a data center that is on the other side of the planet, the speed of light doesn't change. So I do actually care about it being hosted somewhat close to me if latency is important to me, for example.
So we got some cloudier guys here at the table with us too. Do you guys care where it's running?
Mostly no. I think you have to do a certain amount of due diligence when you're checking out the product to make sure that they have SLAs and guarantees around it. But if it's really just hinging on another product that also has SLAs and guarantees, then it's only as good as those contracts are. There are some proximity issues, but that's more about inspecting the service and not necessarily the underlying architecture that makes it up.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, you shouldn't really care. And partly it depends on the service it's providing. So if it's something that does need that locality, like backups or something that might be somewhat high throughput, then you're going to care kind of the locations and make sure it's close. But if it's something more that can be provided through CDNs, that can be provided globally, you don't care. And one of the questions here, I think, as well, is really interesting, is if you've done all that due diligence and you've accepted that SaaS service based on the provider they're using, and then that SaaS service decides we're going to change provider, does that break the SaaS model? Because then they need to go to every one of their customers and go, you now need to re-sign this contract because you signed the contract saying we'd be on that provider. And it kind of breaks that agility of a SaaS provider to be able to change their cost model underneath.
I agree that you shouldn't need to care, mostly, apart from physics existing as a thing. But you do. Practically, you do actually have to care because of issues around design, the fact that people haven't actually built a data center in certain locations, or they have built a data in certain locations and not others, such as regulations like GDPR, or Facebook has access to all of my data and I don't want them to, so I'm going to put it somewhere else. Or you have the issue of Microsoft versus the United States. If my email happens to be on a service that is owned by an American company, congratulations, the NSA can now read all of my email.
Yeah, that's a real good point right there, because I think even the most ardent cloud supporter would support the idea, not necessarily of what particular provider it is, but what geo or political location it is.
Yeah, so the petitioning is important, but it's not only physical location, it can also be logical location, such as, is this within the realms of something which a particular government can come and grab? So do you care that the Chinese government has access to all of your iCloud keys now if you live in China?
So
or even if you happen to be sort of living or passing
through. If you need to be
name.
somewhere which is apparently part of China, even though the rest of the world may not necessarily agree with that, Taiwan.
So you have to do your due diligence on those pieces. And I guess the question is, what level do you care? So the premise of this discussion is, do you care the hardware that they're running in that data center that SaaS location is running on. I probably think we can all agree we don't care.
Well, let's take that one. Do you care about the hardware that it's running on?
I don't think I would say all the way down to the minute hardware level, but I think definitely in terms of the architecture, I think it's very important in terms of, even though we've mentioned SLAs, it kind of becomes one of those things of what's your sort of return if the SLA is broken? Is it the customer experience is gotten back? Because at the end of the day, if you have an outage and your customer can't get to whatever service you're providing, can you just go to them and say, hey, our SaaS provider had an outage, sorry, can you still trust us?
Down to that hardware level, and you're talking about the architecture, do you care whether they're using iSCSI or NFS?
Well, I care if they're using something that's subject to Spectre and it hasn't been patched yet.
Do you?
If it hasn't been patched yet, yes, because someone else who's also running on the same provider has access to all of my private keys.
Well, you would say
if they're at that level.
I was going to say in a SaaS situation, they shouldn't, because you need a certain level of access down to the process level to be able to extract secrets from one running process to another. But the whole idea of SaaS is you are abstracted at a level that you're never getting direct access to the operating system of whatever's running. Yeah, we're talking about SaaS, not IaaS or PaaS or anything like that. We're talking pure SaaS. Why did you buy SaaS in the first place?
Well, I said cloud, but you said SaaS.
Okay, well, that's...
okay, so yeah.
So now we
when we started
the cloud.
Yay! Well, when we started the conversation prior to the podcast, I was speaking entirely about SaaS. I might care a lot more about what's running if it's IaaS, because then I do have operating system level access. And if I can break out into the hypervisor and get into your virtual machine, then that's a real problem. But if I'm just consuming a service and it's software as a service and I don't have that lower level of access, then maybe I don't care as much about the hardware or at all. So I guess it's more, why did you choose SaaS in the first place? It was probably because you wanted to reduce the administrative burden of managing all the components that would make up that software stack. You just want to consume it like a utility. So is it important in that case to understand all the minutia of the underlying architecture?
And that gets to a question, I think, of trust and of buy-in, right? It depends on the extent to which you're buying into the cloud as a solution versus as a location or as hardware or infrastructure. I guess it is kind of an IaaS versus SaaS question.
If I'm buying solution as a service, as distinct from software as a service, then no, I can care less at a higher level of abstraction if the service has been well designed. To some, depending on what well-designed means.
Yeah, and again, how deep do you dig into that well-designed? Because I would argue that for some of this, you take an SLA and you go, because take the big, some of the obvious examples of SaaS. Office 365, for example, how deep am I digging into that service to understand how it's designed under the bonnet? A lot of it is cloak and dagger. So I'm taking an SLA that says it's going to be available, they're going to keep my data durable, and I accept that.
No, so it'll depend on how important it is to my business. So, one of my favourite questions around SLAs is if you breach SLA, what do I win? Because if I need to make sure that, because if it's really important to my business and you're down for a week, and I go bankrupt because I can't access my service, then I can't afford to spend on lawyers for 6 months to try to get you to provide me with credits that I now can't use.
Right, which I think that leads into the due diligence part of it, is assume that SLAs will be broken at some point, and what's the financial impact to you?
And the risk assessment of going on board.
Right, and if that's the case, then you need to design whatever your offering is to the end user to be resilient against failure of a particular service you're consuming. So if you're using IaaS in Azure, you also want to use IaaS in AWS and have your application somehow load balance between those two so that either one of them can break their SLA and you're still up and running.
Or maybe have some stuff that's on site.
No, that's ridiculous. No one does that.
I think the other challenge is from a security standpoint of trying to peek underneath the covers of, are they encrypting passwords as they should in databases and different things like that? Because time and time again, we've seen where that inherent level of trust is placed in a SaaS provider, and it comes up short.
Yes, and they horribly violate it.
Oh no, who could that possibly be?
We're not naming names.
It could be anyone. It could be everyone. And that's, I guess, another question. Do you
Trust
again, it's how much do you trust in the provider? How much do you trust that they're going to live up to their promises? And how much do you trust that their architecture is right in the first place? Because that's the other thing. I mean, if they can't, live up to their security promises, are they really living up to their architecture promises? I mean, if they won't tell you how many replicas of their data they're storing and things like that, are they really going to live it up?
I think some of this comes down to actually meeting certain compliance and certifications, so you can actually do that comparison and not keep asking the same questions to all these providers. So if you look at ISO 20001, SOC, I mean, if you look at Amazon, they have that where you can go online at is it Artifact, or you can pull all those details.
Right.
And oftentimes people will want to go and assess these providers, and they go, just look, we've been assessed lots of times by probably more competent auditors.
Right.
We're sending.
Maybe.
They'll give you the attestations of those certificates. Now,
Do you trust that?
the deeper question is, are any of those certifications any good?
Yeah.
And it's varying degrees, right? If you're PCI DSS certified, I really want to know what you're doing because I don't trust that certification at all.
Well, S&P and Moody's and everyone said it was AAA, so it must be good.
Well, that's the other thing, is that a lot of these companies aren't claiming certifications, TM. They're claiming, oh, well, the government trusts us, or this government agency trusts us, or this big company trusts us. I mean, you know of this giant company, they use us, so you should too. That's certainly not a certification.
No.
Would you buy that?
Well, I know big companies always make good decisions, so yes, I would. Seriously, though, I mean, that's not a good argument, obviously, for consuming a particular service.
It's an argument, though. It is the idea of social proof. 100 million customers can't be wrong. Well, yes, they absolutely can, but what is the likelihood that all 100,000 of them are all wrong simultaneously? So that it is trying to use a proxy for due diligence when a company is not actually saying, yes, you can completely come in and see exactly how we've done everything because it's secret source. So otherwise we have to have total transparency from these organisations, which then means that they can't have competitive advantages within some of the special ways that they do stuff. That's kind of an inherent tension, I think.
I don't think you're convincing us. Are they convincing you, Martez?
Not really convincing me, because even you go to the whole certification thing, I mean, technically those are just point-in-time snapshots of their environment. And I've seen some places where, we got compliant for the audit and things slipped back after the audit, and we're waiting for that next audit the next year or whatever it may be.
Everyone runs around cleaning everything just before your mother-in-law visits.
With the white glove.
Yeah.
So have we convinced you guys that you should care?
No. I think you have to care down to a certain level.
So
of
you
the
do care. Yes, we win.
You have to care about things, yes, broadly speaking, but there's a certain level at which they're not going to show you what they're doing, and honestly, if you care that deeply about it, run it yourself.
Yeah. I think you shouldn't just blindly accept it and use these services, especially like SaaS services we're talking about. But there's due diligence and there's that risk decision to make about your SLAs and then downtime, and accepting that, going in with an open face, open mind. But I'm just going to, if I accept that SLA and those certifications, those pieces, I'm not going to get much more detail out of these guys, because and your option is just to go and run it yourself and deal with running it on-prem and all the caveats and everything that come with that. And that's an option that's perfectly valid. But I think the adoption is showing that people, whether they go in or not, with having done the due diligence, people are going in large measures.
So I should care, but also not.
Yeah, we've got to sleep. Okay.
Well, it's not a binary thing. You should care up to a certain watermark, and then if you really care beyond that watermark, maybe the cloud's not the right fit for you. Yeah. I know that might be heresy right now, but
and I think that's where I'm going to leave this. So I think I'm going to say that you should care if you're a nerd. And if you care and you're a nerd, then the cloud is really no place for you. So therefore, nerds, unplug. Thanks for listening to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, remember to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, since that really helps our visibility. And share the show with your friends. This podcast was brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. And thanks for listening.